1800s family photo found, and the child in the corner isn't supposed to be there. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Massachusetts Historical Society's archive room, casting long shadows across rows of storage boxes. Michael Torres, a 34-year-old archival specialist, carefully lifted the lid off a container marked Bennett Family Collection, 1840s-1860s. The musty smell of old paper and leather filled his nostrils as he began cataloging the contents. Letters, deeds, ledgers from a once prosperous Boston merchant family. He had processed dozens of similar collections over his 8 years at the Society. Most contained predictable items: family correspondence, business records, the occasional daguerreotype. This one seemed no different until his gloved hands touched a wooden frame at the bottom of the box. Michael lifted it carefully. The daguerreotype showed a formal family portrait from 1847, the silver plate still remarkably preserved despite its age. 7 people posed stiffly in an ornate parlor: a stern-looking man in his 50s with mutton chops, a woman in a dark dress with her hands folded, 3 children in their Sunday best, and 2 elderly relatives seated in chairs. He almost set it aside to continue cataloging when something caught his eye. In the right corner of the image, partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain, was another figure, a small child, perhaps 8 years old, with large dark eyes staring directly at the camera. The girl's face was slightly blurred, as if she had moved during the long exposure time required for daguerreotypes. Michael leaned closer, his breath catching. Something felt wrong. The family was clearly wealthy, dressed in expensive clothing, positioned formally. But this child in the corner wore a simple cotton dress, and her positioning seemed deliberate. Not quite hidden, but not openly included either. He checked the documentation that came with the collection. The family inventory listed 7 people in the household for 1847: Samuel Bennett, his wife Catherine, their 3 children, and Catherine's parents. 7 people. But there were 8 in the photograph. Michael pulled out his magnifying glass and examined the image more carefully. The child's features were distinctly different from the Bennett family members. Her darker complexion, her clothing, her almost invisible positioning. It all suggested she wasn't supposed to be there, at least not officially. His heart began to race. In 15 years of archival work, he had learned that the most important historical discoveries often hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Who was this child, and why was she hidden in the corner of a family portrait? Michael spent the rest of that Friday afternoon photographing the daguerreotype from every angle, making detailed notes about the mysterious child. By the time he locked up the archive at 6, his mind was racing with possibilities. He barely slept that night, the image of those dark eyes haunting him. Saturday morning found him back at his desk, surrounded by reference books about 1840s photography techniques, Boston social history, and family documentation practices. He had called in a favor from his colleague, Dr. Patricia Hammond, a historian specializing in antebellum New England families. Patricia arrived at 10, carrying 2 cups of coffee and her ever-present leather notebook. At 62, she had spent 4 decades researching Boston's historical families and had an encyclopedic knowledge of their interconnections. "Show me what you found," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Michael placed the daguerreotype between them. Patricia put on her reading glasses and leaned forward, studying it silently for several minutes. Her expression shifted from curiosity to intense focus. 1847, she murmured. The Bennett family. Samuel made his fortune in textile imports. She pointed to the patriarch in the image. Catherine came from the Whitmore family, old Boston money. Her finger traced to the woman. These would be their children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and young Samuel Jr. "But the child in the corner?" Michael asked. Patricia's jaw tightened. "She's not in any family records I've ever seen, and I've researched the Bennetts extensively." They were meticulous record keepers. Births, deaths, servants, everyone who lived in that house was documented. She paused. Except her. Michael pulled out a folder containing the family's household ledgers from 1847. "I went through these last night. Food purchases, clothing expenses, medical bills, everything is accounted for, but the quantities suggest more people than the official 7-member household." "Extra food?" Patricia asked sharply. "Consistently. About 20% more than 7 people would need. And look at this." He pointed to an entry from March 1847. "Payment to a seamstress for children's clothing, plural. But they only had 3 children, and the clothing budget seems excessive." Patricia stood and walked to the window, her coffee forgotten. Michael, do you know what Boston was in 1847? Tell me. One of the most active stations on the Underground Railroad. The words hung in the air between them. Michael felt his pulse quicken. The revelation sent Michael and Patricia down a new path of investigation. Monday morning, they reconvened with additional resources: maps of known Underground Railroad safe houses in Boston, lists of documented conductors, and passenger manifests from ships arriving at Boston Harbor between 1845 and 1850. The Bennett house was on Beacon Hill, Patricia said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table. This street. Her finger landed on a row of townhouses. We know of 3 confirmed safe houses within 4 blocks of their residence. Michael examined a leather-bound journal he had found in the collection, Samuel Bennett's personal diary from 1847. Most entries were mundane: business transactions, social calls, weather observations, but some passages caught his attention. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. April 12, 1847. Received unexpected visitors after midnight. Catherine prepared the upper room. Heavy fog provided suitable cover. Then nothing for 3 days, followed by guests departed safely northward, prayed for their journey. Patricia's eyes widened. Coded language. Unexpected visitors arriving at midnight, upper room, departed northward? That's textbook Underground Railroad terminology. They found more entries following similar patterns throughout spring and summer of 1847. Each time, Bennett mentioned guests or visitors who arrived at night and left within days. The timing aligned with known escape routes from southern states through Philadelphia and New York, then northward to Canada. But why would they photograph the child, Michael wondered. It seems incredibly risky. Patricia considered this. Daguerreotypes required long exposure times, sometimes up to a minute. The family had to hold perfectly still. If the child was living in the house, even temporarily, it would be nearly impossible to keep her completely out of sight during a formal sitting. Or, Michael suggested, maybe someone wanted her in the photograph. Look at her position. Behind the curtain, but not completely hidden. Her face is blurred, but she's looking at the camera. This feels deliberate. They decided to search for more concrete evidence. Patricia had connections with the Boston African American Historical Society, and within 2 days, she arranged a meeting with Jerome Walker, an elderly genealogist who had spent 50 years tracing families descended from escaped slaves. Jerome arrived at the archive on Wednesday afternoon, moving slowly with a cane but possessing sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When Michael showed him the daguerreotype, the old man's breath caught audibly. Jerome studied the photograph for a long time, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the frame. Finally, he set it down gently and removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. "I've seen her before," he said quietly. "Not this exact photograph, but I know who she might be." Michael and Patricia exchanged glances. "How?" Patricia asked. Jerome reached into his worn briefcase and pulled out a folder containing copies of documents, letters, and sketches. "I've been researching the story of a woman named Grace who died in Toronto in 1912. She was 92 years old, and before she passed, she told her grandchildren about her escape from Maryland in 1847 when she was just 8 years old." He spread several papers across the table. Grace never revealed her original enslaved name, but she described her journey in detail. She was separated from her parents when her owner's plantation was sold to pay debts. A Quaker family purchased her with the explicit purpose of freeing her, but Maryland law in 1847 made immediate manumission nearly impossible. "So they smuggled her north," Michael said. "Exactly. Grace's account mentions traveling hidden in a wagon to Philadelphia, then to New York, and finally to Boston. She said she stayed in a beautiful house with tall windows and red curtains for nearly 3 months, while arrangements were made for her passage to Canada." Patricia leaned forward. "Red curtains. The Bennett house had red velvet curtains in the parlor. I've seen them described in estate inventories." Jerome nodded. "Grace said the family treated her with kindness, that the woman of the house taught her to read, and that the children shared their toys with her. She said she felt safe there, truly safe, for the first time since being separated from her parents." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. 3 months. That's a long time to hide someone. "It was dangerous," Jerome confirmed. "The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was still in effect, and slave catchers operated openly in northern cities. If the Bennetts were caught harboring Grace, they could have faced massive fines, imprisonment, and social ruin." Patricia pulled out Samuel Bennett's diary again. "Look at the dates. If Grace arrived in spring 1847 and stayed through summer, that aligns perfectly with Bennett's coded entries about guests and visitors. Jerome opened another document, a handwritten letter dated 1908. This is from Grace's daughter, written to a church in Boston, trying to find the family that had saved her mother. She had few details, just the name Bennett, the location on Beacon Hill, and her mother's description of the house. Did anyone respond? Michael asked. No. By 1908, the original Bennetts were all deceased, and the house had been sold. The trail went cold. Michael requested access to Boston police records from 1847, hoping to find evidence of slave catchers operating in the city. What he discovered was more disturbing than he anticipated. The archived police reports showed frequent activity by Southern agents prowling Boston streets, offering rewards for information about fugitive slaves. In July 1847, two men from Maryland, Benjamin Crawford and James Rutledge, arrived in Boston with legal documentation claiming ownership of a Negro girl, approximately 8 years of age, escaped from Talbot County, Maryland. The description matched Grace's known origins. Crawford and Rutledge had posted notices throughout the city, offering $50, a substantial sum at the time, for information leading to her capture. They were hunting her, Patricia said, reading over Michael's shoulder, and they knew she was in Boston. Samuel Bennett's diary entries from July became more cryptic and anxious. July 18th, troubling news from the harbor. Wolves prowling near the fold. Must take precautions. July 20th, Catherine suggests the sitting proceed as planned. To cancel would draw suspicion. The Lord's protection upon us all. The sitting, Michael repeated, the daguerreotype. This was taken in July 1847. Patricia understood immediately. They took the family portrait as planned, even though Grace was in the house, because canceling would have been suspicious. Photographers booked sittings weeks in advance. If the Bennett family suddenly postponed, it might have drawn attention. But they hid her behind the curtain, Michael added. Not perfectly, but enough that casual observers wouldn't notice. The photographer probably thought she was a servant child told to stay out of the frame. They found more evidence in the collection. A letter from Catherine Bennett to her sister in Philadelphia, written in August 1847. Most of it discussed mundane family matters, but one passage stood out. The small bird we sheltered has flown safely to freedom beyond the reach of cruel hunters. We sleep more peacefully now, though we miss her bright spirit. Thomas and Elizabeth ask after her daily. She made it to Canada, Patricia whispered. Grace escaped. But the records revealed how close the Bennetts had come to disaster. On July 28th, just a week after the daguerreotype was taken, Crawford and Rutledge had obtained a warrant to search several Beacon Hill homes suspected of harboring fugitives. The Bennett house was on their list. Samuel Bennett's diary entry from July 28, 1847 was longer than usual, and his normally steady handwriting showed signs of stress. Words crossed out, ink blots, irregular spacing. This morning brought trial by fire, Bennett wrote. At 9:30, a knock upon the door announced the arrival of police constables accompanied by two men whose eyes betrayed their mercenary purpose. They carried papers authorizing search of premises for stolen property, though we all understood the true nature of what they sought. Michael read the passage aloud to Patricia and Jerome, who had returned to help piece together the full story. Catherine's composure was admirable, Bennett continued. She received them in the parlor with perfect courtesy, offering tea as if they were social callers rather than intruders seeking to destroy an innocent child's chance at freedom. The children, well instructed, played quietly in the nursery. The diary described how the searchers spent 2 hours examining every room: the kitchen, the bedrooms, the cellar, even the attic. They opened wardrobes, looked under beds, checked behind curtains. Catherine accompanied them throughout, maintaining polite conversation while her heart surely raced. But they found nothing, Patricia said, reaching the next page. How? If Grace had been staying there for 3 months, where could she have hidden during a thorough search? Jerome smiled slightly. Boston's old houses were built with certain architectural features that proved remarkably useful during this era. Hidden spaces between walls, concealed root cellars, false-backed wardrobes. Michael returned to the Bennett house's architectural drawings, which he had requested from the city's building records department. He studied them carefully, comparing the blueprints to photographs of the house taken before its demolition in 1923. Look here, he said, pointing to the second-floor layout. There's a discrepancy. The master bedroom's dimensions don't match the external wall measurements. There's approximately 3 feet of unaccounted space. Patricia traced the lines with her finger. A hidden room? Or a passage, Jerome suggested. Many safe houses had escape routes built into their architecture. If slave catchers arrived at the front door, the fugitive could slip through a hidden passage to a neighboring house or exit onto a different street. Bennett's diary provided indirect confirmation. The wisdom of careful construction proved its worth this day. Our careful planning bore the fruit of safety. The hunters departed, frustrated and empty-handed, while innocence remained secure. The entry concluded with a telling observation. Mr. Crawford grew suspicious of the parlor curtains, commenting that they seemed recently disturbed. Catherine explained that the children had been playing there yesterday. He accepted this, not knowing that just beyond that curtain, behind the wall, a precious soul held her breath and prayed. Now August brought a shift in Samuel Bennett's diary tone from anxious to melancholic. On August 3rd, he wrote, "The time has come for our dear little friend to continue her journey. The arrangements are finalized. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark." Michael found a corresponding entry in Catherine Bennett's personal letters. "My dear sister, I write with a heavy heart. The child who has brightened our home these past months must depart for safer shores. Though my mind knows this is necessary and right, my heart aches at the separation. Elizabeth has been crying all day, and young Thomas asked if we might accompany her northward. Even father and mother, who initially feared the risk we undertook, have grown to love her gentle spirit." Patricia discovered financial records showing a significant withdrawal from Samuel's business account on August 4th, $200, an enormous sum in 1847. "Payment for passage," she said. "Ship captains charged premium prices to smuggle fugitives to Canada. They risked criminal prosecution if discovered." Jerome had researched the Underground Railroad's final routes from Boston to Canada. There were 2 primary paths. One went overland through Vermont and New Hampshire, crossing into Quebec. The other involved ships sailing directly to Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. Given the timing and the amount Bennett paid, I believe Grace traveled by ship. Samuel's diary entry from August 5th confirmed this. She departed last night in the company of Captain Morrison, a man whose character and discretion I have verified through trusted friends. The fog was thick upon the harbor, which Providence surely arranged for her protection. Catherine gave her a small parcel, some warm clothing, a primer for continued study of letters, and a small wooden cross that belonged to Catherine's grandmother. The entry continued with emotion rare in Bennett's typically factual writing. "I confess I wept as she left our door. This child, whom we knew for mere months, has marked our hearts permanently. She reminded me why we risk everything, because each soul is precious beyond measure, and freedom is a right endowed by God, not man." But there was one more crucial detail. On August the 6th, Bennett wrote, "Strange occurrence this morning. In the parlor, where the daguerreotype sitting took place, I found a small handprint upon the wall behind the curtain. Tiny fingers pressed against the plaster. I have instructed the household to leave it undisturbed. Let it remain as testament to her presence, visible only to those who know to look." Michael immediately contacted the current owners of the Bennett property, which had been converted into condominiums in 1985. After explaining his research, he convinced them to allow a careful examination of the original parlor wall. The following Saturday, Michael and Patricia met with a restoration specialist named David Chen at the Bennett building. The current owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had lived in the converted parlor space for 20 years without knowing its history. "I always wondered about this wall," she said, gesturing to the area where the red curtains once hung. "It's original plaster, one of the few interior walls that wasn't demolished during renovation." David carefully set up his equipment, specialized lights, magnifying tools, and a gentle chemical solution that could reveal traces invisible to the naked eye. He worked methodically, examining each section of the wall behind where the curtains would have hung in 1847. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a spot about 3 feet from the floor. "Look." In the ultraviolet light, a small handprint appeared, child-sized, the fingers clearly defined. But there was something more. Beside the handprint, faint scratches in the plaster formed letters. Michael leaned closer, his breath catching. Someone had carved words into the wall with something sharp, probably a nail or pin. "Grace was here, 1847, free." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She left a message. She wanted someone to know. But there was more. Beneath those words, in different handwriting, more educated, more practiced, another message. "May all who seek shelter find it. May all who flee bondage find freedom. May love always triumph over cruelty. CB. Catherine Bennett, Michael whispered. She found Grace's message and added her own. David took careful photographs while Mrs. Hartwell watched in stunned silence. All these years, she said softly, history was hidden right here in my living room. Jerome, who had accompanied them, produced his folder of documents again. Grace's testimonies to her grandchildren mentioned that she left something behind in Boston, scratched into the wall so the house would remember. Her descendants thought this was metaphorical, a poetic way of saying she left her mark on history. But it was literal. The discovery made news within the historical community. Within a week, Michael received a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Dr. Linda Morrison from Toronto, a genealogist who had seen news coverage of the discovery. My grandmother was Grace's great-granddaughter, she said. We have something that I think you need to see, something Grace kept her entire life and passed down through our family. She called it her freedom portrait. Michael felt his heart race. A portrait? A sketch. Grace said it was drawn from memory by someone who had seen her in Boston, someone who wanted her to have an image of that time. We never understood what she meant, until now. 2 weeks later, Michael and Patricia traveled to Toronto to meet Dr. Linda Morrison and her family. Linda, a woman in her 60s with warm eyes and her ancestors' gentle manner, welcomed them into her home where 4 generations of Grace's descendants had gathered. My grandmother told me that Grace believed in the power of memory, Linda explained, leading them to her dining room. She said we must never forget where we came from, who helped us, and what freedom truly costs. On the table lay a carefully preserved sketch, dated September 1847 and signed simply E.B., Elizabeth Bennett, Samuel and Catherine's daughter, who would have been 12 years old that summer. The drawing showed a young girl standing in a parlor, looking out a tall window. Though rendered with a child's hand, the sketch captured remarkable detail. The curve of the girl's face, her serious expression, the simple dress she wore. In the corner of the sketch, Elizabeth had written, "My friend Grace, I will remember always." Grace carried this with her to Canada, Linda said. When Elizabeth drew it and gave it to her just before she left Boston, she told Grace, "You were here. You mattered. We will never forget you." Michael examined the sketch alongside photographs of the daguerreotype. The girl partially hidden behind the curtain and the girl in Elizabeth's drawing were unmistakably the same person. But Linda had more to share. She brought out a wooden box containing Grace's personal effects. The primer Catherine had given her, now worn from decades of use. The wooden cross, darkened with age, and letters. Grace learned to write in Canada, Linda explained. She worked as a seamstress, married a freed man named Daniel, and had 4 children. But she never forgot the Bennetts. She wrote to them for over 40 years. The letters revealed an extraordinary relationship. Catherine Bennett had written back, their correspondence continuing until Catherine's death in 1889. The women shared news of their families, discussed literature and current events, and supported each other through joys and sorrows. One letter from 1863, written during the Civil War, was particularly poignant. Catherine wrote, "My dear Grace, Thomas has enlisted despite my fears. He says he fights for you and all like you, that the evil of bondage must be torn from our nation's soul. I am terrified for him, yet proud beyond words. You have taught our family that some causes are worth any risk." Grace's response, written 3 months later, "Your Thomas fights for a righteous cause. Tell him that this old woman, once a frightened child in your parlor, prays for his safety and blesses his courage. Tell him that freedom, once earned, can never be truly taken away, for it lives in the heart." Thomas Bennett had survived the war and returned to Boston, where he became a prominent abolitionist speaker. The discovery of Grace's story spread beyond academic circles. Local Boston news covered it, then national outlets picked it up. The power of the hidden handprint, the sketch, and the decades-long friendship between Grace and Catherine resonated deeply with people across the country. Michael worked with the Massachusetts Historical Society to create a permanent exhibit about Grace and the Bennetts, featuring the daguerreotype, Elizabeth's sketch, selections from the letters, and carefully preserved samples of the wall plaster bearing Grace's message. On a bright October morning, 6 months after Michael first discovered the photograph, the exhibit opened to the public. Grace's descendants traveled from Toronto and across the United States to attend. The gathering included over 40 family members, representing 5 generations stemming from Grace's 4 children. Mrs. Hartwell, who owned the former Bennett parlor, had made a remarkable decision. She worked with preservationists to cut out and stabilize the section of wall containing Grace's handprint and Catherine's message, donating it to the Historical Society. "It belongs to everyone now," she said simply. "History isn't meant to be hidden behind private walls." During the opening ceremony, Linda Morrison spoke about her ancestors' legacy. Grace used to tell her grandchildren, "Freedom isn't just being able to walk away. Freedom is being seen, being remembered, being known." For over 175 years, Grace was hidden in that photograph, a blur behind a curtain. But she was always there, always part of the story, waiting for someone to really look and really see her. Michael stood in the gallery, watching visitors examine the daguerreotype with new eyes. Children pressed close to the glass, pointing at the girl in the corner. Adults read the wall text describing the Underground Railroad, the Bennett's courage, and Grace's remarkable life in Canada. Patricia joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know what strikes me most about this story?" she said. "The Bennetts could have kept Grace completely hidden during the daguerreotype sitting. They could have waited until after she left to have their portrait made. But they included her, even partially, even at great risk. They wanted evidence she existed," Michael agreed, "even if only they knew to look for her." In a corner of the exhibit, a video screen showed interviews with Grace's descendants. They spoke of her strength, her kindness, her insistence on education and dignity. One great-great-grandson, a professor at McGill University, shared a story Grace had told often. She said the Bennett children would play a game with her where they'd hide, and she had to call out, "I see you," when she found them. She said Mrs. Bennett told her, "In this house, you are seen, you are known, you matter." Those words sustained her for 92 years. As the afternoon sun streamed through the gallery windows, illuminating the daguerreotype, Michael thought about all the hidden histories waiting to be discovered. Stories tucked into corners of old photographs, scratched into walls, preserved in letters and sketches by people who refused to let important truths disappear. Grace had been right. Being seen, being remembered, being known, that was freedom's truest form. And now, 177 years after a frightened 8-year-old girl hid behind a curtain while slave catchers searched for her, her story was finally fully visible.